And welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you've joined us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena that I call the wellness paradox. That is the gap between what we know as a health sciences community and what we actually implement in the real world to make a real difference with real people. This podcast is all about closing off those gaps by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that today, we're joined by Dr. William Cromwell. Dr. Cromwell is a lipidologist. That basically means he studies blood lipids. Throughout the course of his several decades career, he's become an expert in things like HDL and LDL and overall cardiometabolic risk. At the tail end of his career, he's actually developed a company of which he's the chief medical officer for that has a very specific diagnostic test to look at overall cardiometabolic health, looking at long-term risk of diabetes and long-term risk of cardiovascular disease. This is far more than just the standard blood draw that you get when you go to see your doctor. I think this is a fascinating conversation with a gentleman who has literally devoted his life to understanding cardiometabolic health. I think you'll find the discussion fascinating as well, particularly if you've wondered if there's more to your blood work than just the HDL, the LDL, and the fasting blood glucose that your doctor talks to you about when you typically go for your annual physical. Any additional information on this episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 12. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. William Cromwell. Well, welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. William Cromwell. Dr. Cromwell, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Mike, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This is going to be a super interesting conversation that's going to dive deep into kind of our biometric understanding of our health. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to be really interested in learning about some of these things that you have to tell us. But just for starters, talk a little bit more about your background that has led you to this point in your career where you've developed this precision health report that we're going to talk about today.
Well, it's been a journey. I'll have to say that. So I guess I can start back with the fact that I went to medical school from a background in physical chemistry. And so you get to medical school and you ask some questions. First question I ask is, what kills people? And the answer was vascular disease. I said, all right, so how do you stop that? And there was kind of a dull look on people's face, and they weren't really sure. There were a few ideas, and one of the things had to do with cholesterol and the particles that carry cholesterol called lipoproteins. And I said, well, you measure that, right? They said, yeah. I said, well, I came from a background of measuring things. I think I'll do that. And they looked at me and said, nobody does just that. Well, why not? I mean, you just told me it's the number one killer, and this may have something to do with it. So that's really as simple as it can be how I got started in this. And so I was very intentional from the time I was in medical school through residency. What can I learn about? Who can I shadow? Who can be my mentor? What are the things I can learn to try to see if we can do something with lipoproteins and how they impact heart disease and diabetes? So fast forward, I started my first lipid clinic in 1988 after I finished a lipid fellowship at WashU in St. Louis. Things were very different back in the late 80s, early 90s. We didn't have the same medicines we have now. We didn't have a lot of the evidence we have now. And so it was kind of a leap of faith, but sometimes you get lucky. And so I threw my hat in the ring and I got lucky. And for 30 plus years, this is what I've done. Along the way, I've had the good fortune to work with some really, really good people. Jim Otvos has been my research partner for nearly 30 years. He's the person who developed the methodology for using nuclear magnetic resonance to quantify lipoproteins. And so we came together with other people and formed a company called LipoMed, which became LipoScience. Our goal was to understand how one way of measuring lipoproteins could add additional information to simple lipids. In some 17 million samples and 600 plus peer-reviewed papers later, we learned a lot. That company was then sold to LabCorp, and after I left LabCorp a few years, I decided, what can I do in the last 15 years or so of my professional career to do a better job of giving people detailed information about themselves, because that's really what's missing right now is people need to know about themselves. Not 1,000 people like them. And so what can we do to bring best science, best understanding, novel solutions to an area which is crippling the economy and the healthcare system, cardiometabolic risk. And that's basically how we came to be at Precision Health Reports.
Yeah, that's an interesting journey. I can only imagine how the technology has advanced since you've gotten into the field. Talk a little bit about that, just from a historical perspective, without diving too deep, realizing that many of our listeners won't understand the nuance. But what is it like? What was it like then versus today? Is it the difference between the beta VCR and our streaming services that we have today? What's the evolution you've seen?
So it's been on many fronts. It may surprise people that this whole idea that cholesterol is carried inside something called lipoproteins was discovered in 1950. So this actually was a little bit ago, but not so long ago. And at that time, knowing that was not the same as measuring that. There was an easy way to measure lipoproteins, but you can measure what's inside a lipoprotein, cholesterol and triglyceride. And that basically is what people did for a long, long time. And they basically ask, can that measurement be good enough? And depending on the question you ask and the people you study, it may look good enough or it may not. It was probably the mid 80s that there was some real energy put behind different types of technologies that could measure more than just cholesterol. And some of those measured the size of particles, some of those measured the number of particles. There were different technologies that were brought to the market. So there was a time of rapid change and competition in the 80s and 90s. And then as the dust settled, we got into the space where what was widely available became a function of what it cost and who was paying for it. And some of these tests were very expensive and not well reimbursed. And so that kind of limited its availability. And then as things became more mainstream, more of a commodity test, if you will, it's been more readily available. But to be honest, I think we still live in a day where people have cholesterol emblazoned on their mind, and they may not know that cholesterol has some limits. And there may be things that you can add to that information for good effect, one person at a time.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about some of those limitations. I think the general lay public thinks in very simplistic terms about cholesterol. I think of my father talking about his LDL and his HDL, and just kind of the conversation ends and begins there. And we're going to dive a little deeper into that. I think it would be important, though, before we start diving into this, for the non-lipidologists who are listening to this podcast, which I imagine are the vast majority of people, they might not know some of the key terminology associated with the cholesterol and lipoproteins and triglycerides. So can you give us a little bit of lipoprotein 101 in terms of important terminology that we should understand?
Well, sure. So let's start with what we know, cholesterol. Cholesterol is a fat that is in every cell of our body. It's absolutely necessary for life. If we didn't have cholesterol, our membranes wouldn't work. We wouldn't be able to make hormones and a variety of other things. And so the body is redundantly programmed to be able to make and to deliver cholesterol to various tissues. So we have this cholesterol. How do you get fat to move around inside blood? Blood is mostly water. Fat and water don't mix. And so there are these carriers, and the carriers of cholesterol are like little tennis balls. They're hollow on the inside, and they have things on the outside that make up a shell. And we call that whole thing a lipoprotein particle. So this particle carries cholesterol. It also carries another fat called triglyceride. And that's basically the most important thing to know, is that there are particles that carry cholesterol. They come from different places in the body. Different particles have different amounts of cholesterol and triglyceride within them. But the body has this really cool integrated physiology where it makes and it delivers, and it has interactions between lipoproteins. If you can think about these particles as what get into the walls of arteries to affect your risk of disease, you're a step up. Cholesterol doesn't just get there by itself. If we're talking about the way that cholesterol influences blockage in vessels, it's because particles that carry that cholesterol can get trapped in the wall of the artery. And that's what starts the process of a plaque or a blockage formation. And so it really all goes back down to these particles and how many you have and which ones are good and which ones are bad. There are two terms that your listeners may be aware of, and you've already teed them up. LDL is one. LDL is low density lipoprotein. That's a particle that carries cholesterol, but it's also a type of particle that is frequently getting stuck in the wall of the artery to cause a plaque. Another term they may have heard of is a protein that's on the outside of all of the potentially bad particles in your blood, and that's called apolipoprotein B. We abbreviate that ApoB. And so ApoB is a protein, and it's on a lot of particles that can hurt you. And that's one way to know how many particles you have is ApoB. And another way to know how many particles you have is the number of LDL particles. That's called LDL particle number. So that's really the nucleus of the nomenclature, right? It's LDL, it's a particle, it's ApoB on the outside of the bad particles, it's the number of LDL particles, and then your listeners know about cholesterol as that thing that has long been associated with risk of disease, but the reason it's a risk is because of the particles that carry it.
Yeah. And then on the kind of reverse side of this, you often hear, if LDL is the quote bad cholesterol, you often hear of HDL, which is referred to as the good cholesterol. Just touch on that in a little bit more of a scientific sense than just good cholesterol.
Right. And so good and bad are terms that really refer to the particle that carry the cholesterol. So bad is LDL because it's a bad particle that hurts you, and good is HDL, which is a particle that has properties that can help you. HDL has many, many properties. It's very complicated, but at the end of the day, HDL has the ability to buffer or retard the development of plaque or blockage in your vessels. So if your way of measuring LDL and HDL is cholesterol, then LDL is the bad cholesterol and HDL is the good cholesterol. But basically, the cholesterol you measure in your blood has one job, and that job is to tell you something about the number of particles that are carrying it around. That's its only job. If it doesn't do that job very well, then it has misled you as to how much you have or how many LDL particles or how many HDL particles. So HDL particles have properties that help you. LDL has properties that promote plaque formation. And there is, if you will, kind of a back and forth between the two. But at the end of the day, the number of bad particles trumps the effects of HDL. So HDL does not buffer one for one an LDL. And that's something that's been out there for a while, is that maybe if you have a high enough HDL cholesterol, it doesn't matter how high your LDL cholesterol is because they kind of offset each other. And it turns out that's not true. Actually, LDL is, think of it like criminals and crime in your town. Crime is committed by criminals. Criminals can be many or few. And the more criminals you have, the more LDL particles in this scenario you have. Police are your protectors. That's your HDL. Now, the fact that they are one step behind the criminals is true, right? So because the bad guys know what they're going to do and the good guys have to wait, the HDL is a little bit behind the LDL. It can't buffer one for one. So if you have crime in your town, you can either decrease the number of criminals, increase the number of police, or both. Both are good ideas potentially, but get rid of the criminals. That's a direct cause and effect of decreasing your crime.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So basically we have, from a deleterious perspective, we have these LDL particles, which are the cause of the formation of plaque. And then we also have this ApoB, which sits on these particles, which seems to be injurious. And I think for the purposes of our discussion, for many of our listeners, I think that's a good start. And I think many people have heard of LDL, but I don't think as many people know of ApoB. And we're going to dive deeper to talk about how that's relevant from a testing perspective. And that's kind of where I want to shift to. And you mentioned it earlier, which is, it sounds like in this latter part of your career, you're really looking to almost make a difference where the rubber meets the road, which is you're looking to say, okay, how do we put information in people's hands that they can actually use actionably to improve their health? And that kind of sounds like it's what you're doing with Precision Health Reports.
Oh, that's right. And so the evolution of that in my career has been being able to work at developing tests that are best in class in helping people know specifically their risk. But that's only part of the equation. The rest of the equation is, what are the clinical factors, your history, your examination, a variety of other factors that we'll talk about in a minute that come together to give you your own unique individual risk. What's missing right now in a lot of medicine is the integration. We just don't integrate information very well, right? So Mike, you have a history, you have a family history. Hopefully it's wonderful, but maybe it's not. You have a background, hopefully you're well, but maybe you have certain medical issues. There are a variety of tests, some conventional, some newer. There are guidelines, multiple guidelines, national and international guidelines that are similar but a little different, that say we should be thinking about a lot of individual detail, one person at a time. Some of these things are called risk enhancing factors, and there's a wide list of them, 30 plus of them. And what we're supposed to do as clinicians is we're supposed to sit down with one patient at a time, take this comprehensive history, your physical exam, the laboratories, all the risk enhancing factors, multiple guidelines. We're supposed to synthesize that together into one nugget of information. And then you and I are supposed to have a conversation and say, where are you? What is your risk? What are the sources of your risk? Where should you be? And how can we get you there? That's not happening. That's a tremendous amount of work. And there's not integration of that taking place. And so that's what we do at Precision Health Reports. We say, if we have the information, we can let computers do what computers do great. They can do the same right answer very quickly, time after time after time. So we spent months and months and months developing and testing and perfecting a system whereby we can integrate all of that information quickly and easily. So a busy clinician doesn't have to try to spend the hours to put all that together. We can simply have them order the information, get the information, have that conversation, and the patient and the doc are singing off a song sheet, which is all tuned to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are in the age of individualization. I think if it's in medicine, if it's in your music, if it's in your Netflix account, we all want to know that things are individualized to us. And it's fortunate to hear we have the technology to start to do that on a medical level. And let's dive deeper. Let's talk about the assessments that Precision Health Reports offers. And I should say, you were nice enough to allow me to take an assessment, which was a very, very interesting experience, particularly going through and filling out all the information ahead of time on my history, going through the report that was sent afterwards. So I've had a chance to see this from the consumer side, and the nerd in me says it was super cool. And the concerned son in me said, Dad, I need you to go get this report done because we do have a strong history of cardiovascular disease in our family. But let's dive a little deeper. Let's help our listeners understand some of the basic principles this assessment was based on and kind of what it does, practically speaking, in its fully actualized form.
So the new term we want to introduce to your listeners is cardiometabolic risk. And you may have heard about this, and there may be different understandings of what that means. But cardiometabolic risk is everything that comes together to put you at risk for heart attack, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. So this is a combination of your clinical history, your traditional risk factors, laboratory and clinical features of something called insulin resistance, various blood tests, these risk-enhancing factors I alluded to just a minute ago. All of this is a huge jigsaw puzzle with over 40 different pieces. And we're putting that jigsaw puzzle together so that at the end you can see your unique risk. That's the first level of detail, is it's cardiometabolic risk, and the cardiometabolic risk report is what we produce at Precision Health Reports.
Yeah, and as we dive into that report a little bit deeper, how is this differing from the standard reports that a physician orders on, say, an annual physical exam? I think everyone's used to going and getting blood work done, and they get fasting blood glucose, and they get their total cholesterol, and maybe they start to talk about their non-HDL cholesterol or things like this. But PHR's report goes much further than that. So maybe as just a frame of reference, we could talk about how it differs from the standard panels that are ordered.
Right. So let's take a step back and ask the question about risk of diabetes, risk of heart attack, and stroke. Historically, risk for these two different problems have been seen as different entities. There are things that put you at risk for diabetes. There are things that put you at risk for heart attack and stroke. And from that kind of siloed mentality, many studies were done to figure out what are risk factors that would show up that would put you relatively at higher risk. So for example, if your total cholesterol is high or your good cholesterol is low, if you have high blood pressure, if you're a smoker, if you have family history, these are risk factors for heart attack and stroke. And for diabetes, if you have a family history of diabetes, if you have elevated blood sugar, if you have increased body waist around the side, waist circumference, or if you're obese, these are all risk factors for type 2 diabetes. And so for a long time, people were keen off of these ideas with their traditional blood test. I'll get my cholesterol level. I'll get a lipid panel. I'll get a fasting glucose. I'll do these things that inform the major risk factors. Now, what's missing there is that there is something else that is linking these two together, and that's called insulin resistance. This is not a new idea, but it's taken a long time to find its way into everyday conversation. So this goes back to the 80s and a guy named Jerry Reven. And Jerry found that there were things that were taking place before people became diabetic, such things as the triglyceride level was going up and the HDL cholesterol was going down. The blood sugar was going up. Blood pressure was going up. Your waist circumference was going up. And these things he linked together in something called the insulin resistance syndrome. Well, what makes that happen? Well, then if you do a little deeper dive on the science, you find there's something called insulin resistance. And what happens is your body makes insulin. Insulin is made to help you metabolize glucose properly and cholesterol properly. And there are cells that receive an insulin signal, most commonly the liver, the muscle, and fat cells. These cells have a job to do when insulin signals them. What happens if they don't do their job? What happens if it's like a child who doesn't respond quickly when you ask them to take out the garbage? Well, you have to repeat yourself. Would you please take out the garbage? And you may have to repeat yourself 2 or 3 times, and eventually the garbage gets taken out. Well, similarly, if the cells aren't listening and responding correctly to an insulin signal, the body repeats itself and more insulin is produced. And as the insulin signal is repeated, eventually the cells fall in line. So this dynamic of insulin resistance is present for decades before blood sugar goes up, before other manifestations of insulin resistance occur. It's a high-risk state for the development of diabetes. It's a high-risk state for the development of heart attack and stroke. So this insulin resistance is not just another factor. It's the center of a storm, right? Like a hurricane. It's the center of the storm, and spinning out in one direction is diabetes and spinning out in the other direction is heart attack and stroke. And the center of this storm, if you can identify it early, number one, gives you opportunities to change what you're doing so you can decrease risk for heart attack and stroke. And number two, it gives you a whole different way of understanding what's my risk and where is it coming from. So for example, if you wanted to know, if you want to know your risk for type 2 diabetes, and you said, well, higher blood sugar is associated with higher risk of diabetes, that's a relatively true statement. Now, let me ask another question. If you and I had the same blood sugar and less than 100 is normal, 100 to 125 is pre-diabetes, over 125 is diabetes, let's pick a number, 110. So we're in the middle of pre-diabetes, Mike and Bill. What is your 8-year risk for getting diabetes, and what is my 8-year risk for diabetes? If you look at big studies, people at the same glucose level can have a very wide range of developing diabetes in an 8-year period of time. So is there more information that would tune that number better to the individual? Well, insulin resistance will. So specifically, there is a measure of insulin resistance called the lipoprotein insulin resistance score, the NMR-LPIR score. And this score has been shown in multiple studies to be a great predictor of new onset diabetes, independent of your blood sugar, independent of your weight, your waist circumference, your triglyceride, your insulin levels, etc. And in a large study called the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, we were able to show that indeed it is both your glucose level and your LPIR score that together in a gender-specific way tells you your 8-year risk of developing diabetes. So now I take 2 pieces of information and put them together, and I don't have to say your risk can be 15 to 45%. I can say, Mike, your risk is 10%, and Bill, your risk is 25%. Well, those are 2 very different numbers. Now I have more detailed information, and I know what I can do about it. Take it a step further. If I were to change my diet, change my exercise, would I be able to reduce my risk for developing diabetes? Absolutely. And how do we know that? The Diabetes Prevention Program. Landmark clinical trial took multi-thousand people who were at risk of diabetes. They had different arms of the study. One arm of the study was therapeutic lifestyle, which was diet and exercise. Another arm of the study was metformin, a medication that we use frequently. Both arms decreased people who went on to have diabetes, but the lifestyle arm did twice as good as the metformin arm. And so when we worked with DPP, we were able to show that it was the lipoprotein insulin resistance score, which was significantly predictive of who developed diabetes and, more importantly, who didn't develop diabetes in response to diet and exercise. So now this is one example of what we do with the report. We take these extra pieces of information that have been proven in large outcome studies to be valuable. We combine them so that individuals can go a step beyond. What does my sugar tell me about my diabetic risk? What does my cholesterol tell me about my heart attack or stroke risk? There's currently something called the metabolic syndrome that doctors look for all the time. And it's a categorical thing. Metabolic syndrome is 5 potential features: your waist circumference, your good cholesterol, your triglyceride, your blood glucose, your blood pressure. If you have 3 or more abnormal findings, we say you have quote unquote metabolic syndrome. Well, does everybody with the same number of findings, the same number of factors, have the same risk for heart attack, stroke, and diabetes? No. Just like with glucose, it's a range. Well, what can you do with that? Well, we employ in the report something called the Metabolic Syndrome Severity Score. And this is an interesting multi-marker that was developed by researchers at the University of Virginia and at the University of Florida. It takes your actual number for your waist circumference and your triglyceride and your good cholesterol and your glucose and your blood pressure in a weighted, ethnic, and gender-specific way. It gives you a number from 1 to 100. High is bad, low is good. And the higher your number, the more metabolic syndrome-related risk you have for diabetes, heart attack, and stroke. What I found in my practice is many people with the same number of metabolic syndrome factors have widely different metabolic syndrome severity scores. So these are examples of things that we do in the report that are easy to understand. We build on the ideas that people already have talked about and know. But what's been missing, as you said, is the personal element. We live in an age of what's being called precision medicine. That means different things to different people, but at its root, it means, what do I need to know about this person that makes them unique and tells them how they're uniquely doing? That's what this report is tuned to do.
Yeah, and that's great. I find it so interesting that the LPIR score, which sounds like it is very much an upstream metric of potential longitudinal issues. And it just, what strikes me is that, yeah, you could end up in the doctor's office with a fasting blood glucose of 170, and you know you have a problem at that point in time that is urgent that you do something about it. But you can look at this LPIR score years and years out, and correct me if I'm wrong, and you could potentially forecast that that issue could exist and then start an intervention at that point before it becomes urgent.
Well, that's absolutely right and critical. We have 2 different data sets that show us that really well. One is the Women's Health Study, because that is a study that's been going on for more than 20 years. So now we got 20 years of follow-up data. And in those 20 years, a lot of people developed diabetes. Guess what? The LPIR score was highly predictive before the glucose ever went up, right? And for people who had slight glucose elevations, high LPIR was significantly more predictive of future risk than low LPIR score. This is also true in the MESA trial, the PREVENT trial, other trials. So there are people out there who have written, not just our group, but other groups that said the LPIR score is an early warning system. It gives you that idea that if you don't change, if things stay the same, you are at significant increased risk of diabetes, but you don't have to stay there. What I tell my patients is it's only scary if you stay there. Don't stay there. You know, it's great to know knowledge is power. Knowledge can be scary. You can get a risk report from Precision Health Reports and say, I didn't know that despite my glucose of 102, I had a 35% chance of diabetes in the next 8 years. I didn't know with a bad cholesterol that was borderline at 128 and a good cholesterol that was a little low at 34, that my particle number was super high. that I have a lot of inflammation, that my long-term risk for heart attack and stroke is very high, that I have other risk-enhancing factors that have been detected. All of this, tells you this is where you are, but you don't have to stay here. Let's come up with a plan to move you to a better place. And as you're executing the plan, how well is the plan working? We can follow these biomarkers and get a much better idea.
Yeah, it's early warning is always the key. Now, you said something that I do want to talk about for a second, because it's fascinating to me, and I think many of our listeners will find it fascinating. It's the difference between just the appearance of LDL on a test as just a sole biometric, and things like particle size and particle density. I don't want to dive too deep into this at the risk of making this a physiology session, but just riff on that for a second. It's just not necessarily about the total cholesterol number. It has a lot to do with the size of the density of those particles in terms of how pathogenic they might be.
Well, that's a great question, and it's a yes and no answer. So if you go back to the idea that cholesterol is in a particle, are there people with low cholesterol or normal cholesterol who are going to have heart attacks? Yes. And we knew that back in the 70s and 80s. It was a real head scratcher, because you look at them, they may not have high blood pressure or other major risk factors, but they definitely had a heart attack. So people started digging deeper. What is it that we can identify that might help us understand why they had a risk for a heart attack when their cholesterol was okay? And particle size was one of the things that came up. So particles come in different sizes, small and large, for example. And in the LDL family, low density lipoprotein is a particle that ranges in size from, say, about 19 nanometers to about 24 nanometers. Okay, so there's a range of size. Researchers found that people who had normal cholesterol and heart attacks had smaller sized particles compared to people who had a similar cholesterol and didn't have heart attacks. So it seemed like particle size was important. Small is also dense. So small and dense go together like pizza, right? So small and dense are basically saying the same thing. Now, the rest of the story. If you consider that you have two jars in front of you, one is big and one is small, and you have a gallon of water that has to be filled up by these jars, in general, you're going to have more small jars needed to have a gallon of water than large jars. So the number of particles will be greater if the size is smaller. That is also true. So when you have an increased number as well as a small size, is there a difference of which one is actually driving the boat of risk? Which one is more important? And at the end of the day, after a lot of interesting adjustments, what you find is that it is the number of particles, not the size, which drives the risk. So play that backwards. If small really was worse than large, then it might be okay to have large size compared to small. Well, are there people out there who have a lot of large particles? Yes, they're called familial hypercholesterolemic patients. And FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, is a genetic disorder that has, unfortunately, a very high risk of early vascular disease. And their problem is they have too many LDL particles, but they're the large particles. That doesn't mean they're good. Right. And so at the end of the day, a one standard deviation increase in either large or small are equally associated with risk. If all you can measure was size in the past, then size was part of the story. If you can measure size and number, you can ask additional questions. And it turns out that number drives the boat. And in this insulin resistant metabolic syndrome type of person, you do have small size, not too high in LDL cholesterol, but a very high number of particles. And that high number of particles is the missing link between the cholesterol risk and what's actually causing it, the number of particles.
Yeah, very interesting. It's like many of these things, when you start to analyze them a little bit deeper, it starts to become such a nuanced discussion. And I'm here to say, probably on behalf of all of our listeners, we're very happy to have people like you and your colleagues that can help provide us that nuanced understanding. But yeah, that's I even learned a couple of things in there in what you said, because I feel like, and maybe this is just my becoming more acquainted with the literature, but it seems like there's a lot more conversation around this in recent years. Is that accurate from your perspective?
Well, there is. And I can tell you, having lived through this for 20 plus years, back in the 80s, there was no appreciation for what we just talked about. And because there were different laboratories involved and different technologies involved and competing statements as to what was important size versus number, there were all sorts of reasons why there was different messaging out there. And at the end of the day, there is still a lot of confusion. But to simply say LDL is bad, a lot of LDL is real bad, that's true. Well, an analogy I use to try to help people that sometimes they get a grin out of is, let's say you're trying to find a place on the beach to put your towel. You look around on the beach, you're looking for an empty spot on the beach, right? That's all you care about. I find a place I can put my towel. And so you tell your kid, hey, I need you to find me a place on the beach that doesn't have too many people. And so your kid comes back and says, I counted a place over there. It has 50 t-shirts. 50 t-shirts. Yeah, there are 50 people wearing t-shirts over there. So there's 50 people. And you go to check his work and you count 100 noses because half the people didn't have a t-shirt on. So how many people are there on that part of the beach? 50 or 100? It's 100. What people don't know, and the simple truth is, the amount of cholesterol carried inside a particle is not constant. Now let that sink in for a minute. It's like going to the Coke machine and getting a can. You always expect 12 ounces because that's the way cans are made. And if that's true, if I tell you I have 24 ounces, you do the math, you have two 12-ounce cans. It just works. Well, if cholesterol was always the same in a particle, then measuring cholesterol would tell you accurately how many particles you have. But if the can coming out of the machine can have 2 ounces, 6 ounces, 12 ounces, you have no idea how many cans you have just by knowing the number of ounces. You have no idea how many particles you have just by measuring the cholesterol. So how different can these numbers be? It's worse in the diabetic or metabolic syndrome or insulin resistant person. They're the center of the bullseye. And in those people, those two numbers can differ significantly 50 to 75% of the time. 3 out of 4 people have no idea what their true number of particles is from their LDL cholesterol. So this becomes the problem. I was speaking at a conference one time. It was a family medicine conference on a Saturday morning. I remember it very well. It was in Cincinnati. I was the second speaker. The first speaker was talking about the runner's knee, and he was a great speaker. It was a funny, great talk, and I thought, I'm in trouble. Because here I am coming to talk about lipoproteins after the runner's knee. That's not going to go over well, right? So I thanked them for having me, and I asked them, how many of you treat LDL cholesterol? Every hand went up. How many of you think cholesterol is a good measure of LDL? Every hand went up. What if it's not? What if cholesterol gets the answer wrong half of the time in healthy people and 3/4 of the time in diabetic or pre-diabetic people? They got real quiet. So you bet the farm on a number that lets you down frequently. What if you didn't have to be let down and you could know the right answer so you could do the right thing for your patient? People started leaning forward. Okay, now we got a story. And that's the story we're telling today. That's the story. It's not a new story. It's been around for a long time. It's just an inconvenient story. And unless you have a way out of jail, a get out of jail free card like a Precision Health Reports, you won't know the details about you and these types of tests that can tell you what's actually going on.
Yeah, our mind favors the simplistic always in lieu of the more complex explanations. We don't like the subtle and the nuanced, but yeah. And when you can get a room of people that just listen to the runner's knee conversation to lean in on lipoprotein conversation, that's you have a solid sales pitch. I want to go back to something just really briefly, and this is probably the science nerd in me. Just for our listeners' sake, we talked about insulin resistance, and we talked about that driving cardiometabolic risk. Can you touch on, in somewhat simplistic terms, the mechanistic underpinnings of that? Like how does insulin resistance 15 years ago result in cardiometabolic risk or an event or atherosclerosis today?
So that can be a long or a short answer. So I'll try to thread the needle here a little bit. So if you ask the question, what's happening when cells are insulin resistant? 3 things are happening. Number one, fat cells are not holding on to the stored fat within them, and they are leaking out non-esterified free fatty acids. And these things go to the liver and get turned into lipid, right? And when they get turned into lipid in the liver says, I don't need this extra stuff here. I don't want to have extra lipid or fat stored in my liver because then I'll have a fatty liver. That's not good. So there are three things the liver can do with this newly formed lipid. It can get rid of it by sending it off into the circulation in a lipoprotein particle called very low density lipoprotein, or VLDL. It can burn it for energy beta oxidation, but that's a little slow. Or it can get backed up and it just sits on the dock with no ship to take it out, and you get a fatty liver. All right, so that's going on. In addition, this VLDL that has been formed increases numerically in the blood. So you have an increased number of large VLDL particles. What happens there? Well, that gets degraded into LDL. So LDL is the end product of VLDL breakdown. So now we have a lot of LDL because there was a lot of VLDL to start with. Because LDL takes a long time to get rid of, it has a 3-day or longer expectancy in the blood. Once you prime the pump at the top, you end up with a lot of stuff that takes a long time to get rid of at the bottom. And so you're increasing the number of LDL particles, and they're small in size. So now the second thing that's happened, I have an increased number of small LDL particles. The third thing that happens is that HDL, the good guy, gets involved in the act. And in a complicated way, the amount of cholesterol in HDL goes down. And so HDL cholesterol is going down. What I just described can be looked at through a lipid lens or a lipoprotein lens. So if I look through the lipid lens, what do I see? Triglycerides going up because that's what's inside VLDL. HDL cholesterol going down. LDL cholesterol, normal, but it's normal because there are many small LDL particles that have less cholesterol inside than expected. The longer your body is exposed to high levels of LDL particles, the more you form plaque and blockage in the wall of your arteries, and the more you accelerate that process. If you have early high particle number in insulin resistance, if high particle number is just an integral part of that physiology, and that's going on for a long time, a decade or more before your blood sugar ever goes up, you've had this unknown battle going on in the walls of your artery for a long time. And by the time other factors may bring you to somebody's attention, things have happened for a while. And we find this with non-invasive imaging studies. I do a lot of these. I have people who come to me with, say, a family history that isn't good. We find that they have insulin resistance and high particle number. I ask the question, how long have these numbers been this way? They don't know because they haven't had a reason to get these numbers checked before. So we look at the vessels non-invasively, either with ultrasound or x-ray, and we find blockage. And so now we have a new conversation. You're a person who has this process that has started. You have early blockage. This isn't something that we're worried about maybe happening. You already have it. And now we need to, really dial in a solution so that we can stop it and you don't have to continue down this risk road that we have intercepted you on.
Yeah, you threaded the needle well there in terms of the complicated and simplistic explanation. That was great because I did want our listeners to understand. People hear insulin resistance and they think, well, that's like a diabetes thing and that's a blood sugar thing. But you've connected it very nicely and succinctly to how it leads to vascular pathology. So I appreciate the physiology lesson. If nothing else, we indulged my curiosity there. I want to get practical really quick in the last little bit of time that we have. And I think the first question that comes to my mind, and I think it probably is coming to a lot of our listeners' minds, is, well, Dr. Cromwell, this is great. How come everyone isn't getting tests like this? How come everyone isn't getting a precision health report, which I'm sure is also a question that you're asking, or a similar test to it, because it seems like these are so predictive upstream and we could resolve so many more costly problems downstream if we addressed it. Why do you feel this isn't happening? And I realize that's a complicated question, but do your best on that one as well.
Well, so the short answer is, as I said at the beginning, integration is hard. In the marketplace before Precision Health Reports came out, there is no entity currently that is taking a comprehensive look at your history, your physical findings, your laboratories, 5 different national and international guidelines, 30 plus risk enhancing factors, and putting it together in a simple, easy to read, colorful report that says, what's my metabolic risk? What's my diabetic risk? What's my cardiovascular risk? And tracks the right numbers over time. Nobody's doing this. I can tell you, I have worked in industry for a while. I have worked in laboratory industry for a while. And I can tell you that the laboratory industry, in my experience, has no interest in trying to get your personal health information, getting all of the right clinical information, and doing this type of report. I have been told so many times, we don't do that. We won't do that. That's not what we do. We give numbers to doctors, and doctors make of the numbers what they will. So there has not been any interest or energy put into this type of report through the mechanisms that people get information, like laboratories. Now, this doesn't mean that laboratories haven't tried to do a better job than the basics. There are many good laboratories out there that give extra information. And some of your listeners may have had advanced tests. And these can be advanced inflammation tests. They can be advanced lipid and lipoprotein tests. Advanced testing has been something that a lot of people have done. And what those reports look like is a lot of information that is next level deep, and a lot of representation that these extra pieces of information tell you more about your risk. That's correct. It can tell you more about your risk. But my question is, what exactly is your risk and why? You see, if you don't know about the person, you take that kind of report and you still have questions. I don't know what to make of this. This information says there's something going on, but what does that really mean? So what we say is, I don't have any limit on my information. I can ask as many questions as I want. I can be informed by as many landmark clinical trials and guidelines, and I can take it all together and say, Mike, you went through a Precision Health report. The way it worked was you got an email. The email came from Precision Health Reports and says, Mike, you've been invited to take this survey, and you answered questions. And once the questions came in, then you got another email that said, Mike, you need to go to the lab. And you went to the lab and you got a discrete set of tests done. You got the NMR lipoprofile test, which tells us about particle number, cholesterol, triglyceride, lipids, your LPIR score. You also got an inflammation score, glycate. You also got a lipoprotein called Lp(a), right? You also got your fasting glucose. And from that, and from all of the guidelines and 100 pages of code, in a matter of seconds, your report was generated. And in your report, it says, Mike, this is your metabolic status, your diabetic status, your cardiovascular status, colorful, clear, easy to understand. And if you get additional reports over time, it will track you over time. Pulling all of that together has never been done before. And we have had this report out in the real world for about a few months. It's taken us a good year to get to the point, starting from nothing, with programmers and the desire to get here, to get where we are. Now, we hope it's successful. We hope it helps a lot of people. And the feedback has been great, both from individuals and from providers. But when you're trying to do something that's brand new, that's never been done before, there's a lot of awareness building that needs to take place. There's a certain amount of inertia that needs to be overcome. That's where we find ourselves. So the opportunity to have this conversation is great, and I appreciate it. But at the end of the day, I think everybody would really like to know, in a more comprehensive way, in a simple and understandable way, what's my risk? And that's what this report tells you.
Yeah, that's great. So the simple answer, and this is an exciting time for any industry, is that this didn't exist before, and now it does exist. But you used the word inertia, and that was the word that came to my mind. And I feel like, our politics and medicine and academia, those are the 3 areas that seem to have the greatest amount of inertia. And I think knowledge is power, and putting the information out there for providers and patients to hear about, I think is important. And one thing you said, and it struck me when I was answering the questionnaire initially when I got that first email you mentioned, all the individual questions it asked about me. And I couldn't help but think the context that was going to provide to the report at the end of the day, because I've gotten blood work done before. And yeah, your physician has some level of context on you, but not the depth that the report went into. So, from my perspective, I'm not only looking at this of all the 100 pages of code and 30 years of research that, really buttressed this system you developed, but also the individualized context it provides. I think, as we said earlier, it's a world of individualization. And if you expect that out of something that is as benign as your Netflix or your Spotify account, you should absolutely expect that from something that literally predicts your risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and possibly death.
Right. So you make a great point. So what I've done for 32 years is clinical lipidology. That's all I do. I see people in my clinic who either come on their own or are referred who have some kind of cholesterol or lipoprotein problem. The processes that I've engaged in for years to get to the detailed answers one patient at a time is largely what started me on this journey. And then, letting the guidelines inform that, let outcome studies inform that, et cetera. So at the end of the day, what would happen if I went down in a fiery plane crash? What would I leave behind? Would there be any way for people to take the same type of methodical, highly personalized approach? Can we, put that into a box, basically, and make it available to the world so that now anybody, anywhere, without a physician, having to sit down and take this information, they can get the answer. And so the patient can be informed, they can be a better advocate for themselves. The provider can be informed, he can have the in-depth conversation the guidelines say we're supposed to have, informed by the patient. And our goal is to make sure that this grows wings and can help as many people as possible.
Yeah, you said something that I was struck by a couple of minutes ago. You said, you guys worked for more than a year putting all this together. And I thought, well, really, you've been working for the past 3 decades that allowed for that 1 year to actually happen. And it is exciting when experts like yourself in a certain area, and I know many people in various areas of medicine that are doing this, think of their legacy and say, what can I leave behind? And it's heartening to know that people are working in that respect. Well, we're coming up on almost the end of our time here. And before I get to my last question, I'm sure many people are listening to this going, where do I go get one of these and how do I learn more about Precision Health Reports? So where can people go if they want to find out a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so good question. We have several different platforms. We're in social media on Twitter and LinkedIn and what have you. So Precision Health Reports, if you just search Precision Health Reports, that'll do it. Our website is precisionhealthreports.com. So both are great places to go for information. We're happy to hear from people. Just real quickly, there are multiple ways that people can get a report. They can get a report through their provider. They can get a report through a network to whom they belong, and we have different networks that we work with. They can also get one individually by going to precisionhealthreports.com. So there are multiple ways that people can get a report, and we are constantly building additional content for people once they get the report and say, what does it mean? So for example, I recorded a video recently that says, understanding your cardiometabolic risk report. And it just takes a few minutes and it unpacks the report one page at a time so people understand. There's also content that's embedded in our report with hyperlinks. So there's a page of additional information. You say, that's kind of interesting, that metabolic syndrome severity score. How do I get more information about that? Click the hyperlink. Or insulin resistance and 8-year diabetic risk. I want more information about that. Click the link. What about high particle number? We call that atherogenic because it causes a plaque. Atherogenic particle number. Click the link, right? So we got a lot of that. And we're building more all the time. I take calls from people. I have people who get a Precision Health Report and say, wow, I need to talk to somebody. And I have a conversation. So we have a lot of different ways for people to get information. Not only, what is in this report, how do I get this report? How do I understand this report? So we're invested in all three. And we use Precision Health Reports, our platform, if you will, our website as kind of an integrating feature there. And we're happy to entertain questions that people have. And once you get your report, if you have any questions, we're happy to walk you through it.
Yeah, and I can attest to the seamlessness of getting a test done in terms of the emails and going to one of 10 labs I think I had access to within, a 20-minute drive of my location. So strongly encourage everyone to go check it out on the website. From the patient or the provider side, I think, as Dr. Cromwell said, if you're a provider and you're hearing this, man, I don't want to use the words cheat code to diminish this, but this is kind of the cheat code to assisting some of your patients with their metabolic health. You get the information delivered, and then you can make accurate clinical decisions based on it. So we will link up to all of that in the show notes to this episode. So you'll have a chance to get to the PHR website from the show notes page. And I want to finish out on our last question, Dr. Cromwell, that we always end the podcast on because it's the title of the podcast. And the wellness paradox for me, the thing that I'm fascinated with is that we know so much, like in your mind is so much about lipidology, yet there's what we know and what we do in the real world. And there's a gap between those two things. And sometimes it's a pretty wide gap. And the goal of this podcast is to try to close off that gap as much as possible. For the people that are listening to this that are in the health sciences, what would be your one piece of advice to how they can close off that gap between what we know and what we do?
Yeah. So I'm really interested in different people's opinion on this. And I bet you get a lot of different answers, having a lot of different guests. But I'll tell you what I think is happening and where we have an opportunity. We are moving through a totally different sphere of healthcare now. We've gone from the days of go to your doctor, he'll tell you what to do, to people who are becoming very consumer driven by their own health information. And they're becoming very adept at understanding what's going on. They're very knowledgeable. They're very active in their patient care. And that is forcing healthcare systems to change a little bit of the way they do business. We've gone from accountable care organizations to healthcare homes to now what some people call a patient-centric or a person-centric model. So a person-centric model doesn't label somebody as a patient. That has the inference of you've got a problem. Patients have problems. We fix their problems. People are people, and we want to help people be well. So a person-centric model is one where you tune all of your information systems, your processes to engaging a person, and the person is empowered with their own specific information to detect anything that's going on at an early rather than late stage of development. And with a person-centric model of early detection, you're going to find things that are highly influenceable long before they rear their ugly head as something like diabetes, a heart attack, or a stroke. We've had a sick model or sick care system for so long that we wait for things to get broken to fix them. Think back in the day, right? Our parents, they may have gone for an annual exam, but that was a perfunctory thing. They weren't going to figure out whether they were well. They were going to see what was wrong with them. And what they frequently found was what was really wrong if they survived their heart attack, stroke, or became diabetic, right? So we worked backwards for years and years and years. To work forwards requires the integration of a lot of information, as well as a receptivity on the part of the person and the physician to want to go there. There are people who have been sounding this for a long, long time. I'm not the first voice to say we can do better and we should look early. Primordial prevention, as some people call it, is finding things at the earliest possible point where we can intervene with proper diet, exercise, and lifestyle change to ward off a lot of things that don't need to happen in the first place. And so if we could focus on one thing, it would be a person-centric model of healthcare delivery where people know as much about themselves as early as possible and are engaged in an opportunity to make the changes necessary without medication right away. Now, medications are fine. I'm the crazy lipidologist who doesn't start with the medicine, I end with the medicine. In my world, medicines are mops and brooms. They clean up a mess. I also have 5 kids that are older now. I remember the days of little hands and little feet and big messes. I could either be my kid's janitor or I could help them learn to make less of a mess, right? So make less mess. That's diet, exercise, and wellness. You may still have things that happen. You may still need medications in the end, but less mess is better than more mess.
I love it. It is about the person. Dr. Bill Cromwell, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox podcast.
Thank you.
Well, I truly hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Cromwell as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares really do make a difference for us. Any additional information from this episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 12. Please be on the lookout for next week's very special episode when it drops on Wednesday. Next week's episode will be a little bit different than our format from the past, and I think represents a pretty significant inflection point early on for the wellness paradox as a medium to get great and relevant information out there to the health sciences community. I'm very excited for next week's episode. Please make sure you download it and please make sure you listen. As always, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And until we chat again, please be well.